Between 1933 and 1945, more than 100 concentration camps operated in Nazi Europe. Within these enclosures, extermination coexisted with an even more disturbing reality: the transformation of human suffering into organized entertainment for the perpetrators. Heinrich Himmler, architect of the camp system, understood that maintaining the morale of thousands of SS guards required channeling violence into specific forms of entertainment that reinforced the dehumanization of the victims. Thus, dynamics were born designed not only to punish but also to entertain within a system that turned horror into a habit. How was it justified to turn other people's pain into a spectacle? What place did fun occupy within the logic of extermination, and why did so many participate without question? Circuses of pain, macabre sports among death. On Sunday afternoons, while most of the prisoners were slowly dying of hunger or disease, some were forced into a makeshift boxing ring in the middle of Auschwitz. Around them, Nazi officers gambled, laughed, and drank. It wasn't a secret practice, it was part of the system. At Auschwitz, each fight could decide whether a prisoner survived another week or was transferred to the gas chamber. Boxing became a tool of public humiliation. Exhausted and starving prisoners were forced to fight each other or even SS personnel. The fights had no referees, no rules. They lasted as long as the commanding officer decided. Some fought until they lost consciousness. Others were executed after being defeated. Tadeusz Pietrzykowski, a Polish boxer, number 77 on the prisoner register, was deported in 1940, and the SS soon noticed his toned body. He was forced to fight more than 60 times in 2 years. His first fight against a German capo was witnessed by more than 200 prisoners and a dozen officers. If he lost, he would face immediate punishment. He won, and so they used him more. He became a recurring attraction. For the next few months, Pietrzykowski fought against much heavier prisoners, with no training, no water, no rest. On several occasions he was thrown into the ring after days of forced labor. He fought anyway, because refusing was another way to die. Young Perez arrived at Auschwitz in 1943. A world flyweight champion, a Tunisian Jew, he had been arrested in France. He was 29 years old and weighed less than 45 kilos after weeks of deportation. At the Monowitz camp, he was recognized by an officer who had seen his fights in Paris. They called him in, fed him a little, dressed him in used sports clothes, and forced him to box. He was introduced as the champion to drunken officers eager for a spectacle. In his first fight, he was ordered to face a guard almost twice his weight. He barely stayed on his feet. They beat him mercilessly. But he fought again. In total, he was forced into more than a dozen fights. He fought not only to survive, but because he knew that many other prisoners would be executed if he didn't provide enough entertainment. One afternoon, after a particularly fierce fight, Young was seen leaning against a wooden post. He was barely breathing. The officer in charge, frustrated by his weakness, ordered him transferred. Days later, during an evacuation march, he was executed with a shot to the head. His body was left lying in the snow. At Mauthausen, Sundays were synonymous with spectacle for Commandant N4zi Europe. One of his favorites was the Spanish Republican boxer Segundo Espallargas, also known as Paulino. Unlike others, Paulino was robust and resilient. He would fight anyone he was ordered to, prisoners or officers. He never lost. His reputation became legendary among the deportees. Paulino's fights took place in the camp yard under the watchful eye of the guards, who bet on rations of alcohol, cigarettes, or simple visiting permits. Losses weren't allowed. Winning meant continuing to fight. Resting meant dying. On one occasion, he was forced to fight after suffering a serious leg infection. He dragged himself to the ring. No one forgot that fight. In the industrial camps of the Auschwitz complex, boxing took on even more perverse dimensions. IG Farben workers organized fights during lunch breaks. Prisoners skilled in different trades were pitted against each other. Electricians against carpenters, cooks against street sweepers. Bets included rations of bread, cigarettes, and minor work privileges. These fights were not directly supervised by the SS, but enjoyed their tacit approval. German bosses acted as organizers and referees. The rules were brutal. Fights to the point of unconsciousness without gloves, with hands bandaged only with dirty rags. Losers were punished with harder labor or reduced rations. SS officers developed specific rituals surrounding these fights. Before each bout, prisoners were required to recite their identification number and their crime against the Reich. During the fights, guards shouted racial and political insults. Afterward, regardless of the outcome, both boxers were physically punished for insufficient spectacle. Symphony for Death, the music that accompanied extermination. In the heart of Birkenau, just behind Block 24, a brothel operated for Nazi officers. Outside every Sunday, an orchestra of female prisoners performed pieces by Beethoven, Schubert, and Wagner. The music was supposed to start at exactly 5 p.m. Inside, the muffled moans of abused women could be heard. Outside, violins masked the crime. At Auschwitz-Wien, the male orchestra was formed in January 1941. They played every day, not for themselves, but to accompany the forced labor marches. At 4:30 a.m., the first bars of music began to play as columns of prisoners marched at dawn. The sickest had to feign steadfastness to the music. Those who fell were dragged along. The orchestra could not stop. In Birkenau, the women's orchestra emerged. It was conducted by Alma Rose, daughter of the conductor of the Vienna Philharmonic Orchestra and niece of Gustav Mahler. A Jewish virtuoso violinist, she was deported from France. Upon arrival, she was identified by her last name. The SS decided to utilize her talent. They ordered her to form a musical ensemble with other female prisoners. The orchestra was to rehearse daily and perform weekly concerts for German officers. The performers had no instruments of their own. The Nazis issued violins, flutes, and cellos confiscated from previous victims. Some women couldn't play. Alma Rose forcibly trained them. The punishment for playing off-key could be death. Twice a week, they performed classical repertoire in front of officers, even during formal dinners. If any guard spoke during the concert, Alma dared to silence them, not out of arrogance, but because she knew her courage as a Birkenau Women's Orchestra was Esther Bejarano, a German Jewish teenager selected for her ability to play the accordion. Her participation did not exempt her from the rigors of the camp. She rehearsed for hours without rest, and then had to line up to accompany the columns of prisoners returning from forced labor. In her memoirs, Esther recounted how she had to play marches while prisoners dragged tools, corpses, or dying comrades on makeshift wheelbarrows. Music wasn't for them, it was for the officers, and silence between notes was punished. On more than one occasion, she saw musicians die next to her for pausing for a few seconds or playing slightly off-key. Music also played a ceremonial role during public hangings. In camps like Flossenbürg, Sachsenhausen, or even in the central square at Auschwitz-the-Wand, the condemned were led before the other prisoners to be executed in exemplary acts. As the bodies hung, orchestras, often composed of other prisoners, were ordered to play military marches or classical pieces. The purpose was not to drown out the screams, but to prevent a collective emotional reaction. If anyone cried or looked away, they were singled out. The musicians had to maintain the rhythm even when the ropes tightened. In some cases, they were ordered to repeat the same measure until the last body stopped moving. In an expression of ideological sadism, the Nazis often imposed ironic or humiliating music as part of their punishment. Jewish musicians, for example, were ordered to play Hebrew folk songs, religious songs, or traditional Eastern European hymns before being sent to work in particularly deadly areas such as crematoria or loading ramps. Sometimes they were made to play upbeat tunes just before their colleagues were selected for death. At the Majdanek camp, a group of musicians was forced to play a mocking version of Hatikva, the Jewish anthem, while surrounded by guards with dogs. After the performance, they were shot one by one. Music in this context was neither a consolation nor an art. It was a tool of power, control, and humiliation. Every note played under duress served to assert the supremacy of the oppressors and dehumanize the victims. And yet, many of those melodies still survive as involuntary reminders of a harmony shattered by brutality. At the Theresienstadt camp, Nazi propaganda took deception to the next level. Jewish musicians, artists, and intellectuals were sent to this camp. The Nazis presented it as a model city for privileged prisoners. In reality, it was a transit center to Auschwitz. During Red Cross visits, prisoners were forced to organize public concerts, stage operettas, and rehearse choirs. After the visits, many of them were deported and exterminated. Coco Schumann, guitarist and pioneer of swing music in Germany, was one such musician. Half Jewish, he ended up in Auschwitz after passing through Theresienstadt. His skills saved his life. He played for the guards even as they formed lines for extermination. One of his most requested songs was The Dove, which the soldiers asked to be played as the prisoners were led to the gas chambers. No one should have suspected anything. At the Neuengamme camp in northern Germany, the director requested a Völker Model 86 piano in 1942. The request was approved. The piano arrived a few months later. It was placed in an officer's room. Evenings with chamber music were held there, while in the nearby barracks, prisoners were dying of typhus. Music wasn't an act of consolation. It was an instrument of silencing. In the punishment blocks, musicians were forced to play pieces to cover the screams of those receiving 25, 50, or 100 lashes. The rhythm had to be maintained. The notes couldn't be missed. In other sections of the camp, musicians were used to accompany executions. In the Płaszów firing squad yard in Krakow, cases were reported where prisoners were forced to sing while digging their own graves. Officer Amon Goeth, the camp commandant, demanded that the music continue until the body reached the bottom. There was no redemption for the musicians. Some survived longer, ate better, but everyone knew they were disposable. The slightest mistake could cost them their lives. In Birkenau, a violinist was killed after going off key during a rehearsal. Her instrument was given to another prisoner. The concerts in the camps were scheduled and obligatory. Those attending were not free. The performers were not allowed to stop playing, cry, or look at the ground. The scores were sometimes real, sometimes invented. The notes were written on recycled paper, in pencil, on scraps of blankets or toilet paper napkins. Most have not survived. When the Soviets and Americans liberated the camps, they found abandoned instruments, torn sheet music, and music stands made from bunk bed wood. In some cases, the bodies of executed musicians still lay next to their violins. Sex under orders, the hidden gear of Nazi brothels. In block number 1 of the Mauthausen concentration camp, a brothel was opened in 1942. It wasn't a secret. The prisoners knew. The officers promoted it as an incentive for those who worked hard. Reward, they called it. The reality was different, serial rapes disguised as privilege. The orders came from the top. Himmler personally approved the creation of a brothel program in at least 10 concentration camps. The motivation wasn't commercial prostitution, but control. The goal was to channel soldiers' sexual desire, prevent homosexual relations among troops, and ensure that the most useful prisoners remained loyal. All of this using female prisoners. The women weren't volunteers. They were selected from among the youngest, healthiest, or most attractive. They were offered reduced sentences, better food, and the possibility of release. Accepting meant entering a sexual hell from which few emerged alive. The block assigned as a brothel was sealed. The inmates were required to serve several men per day. In Mauthausen, days were documented where a woman was forced to have relations with up to 15 men in one afternoon. In the Gusen subcamp, conditions were even worse. The women were subjected to relentless torture. There were no breaks between sessions. Some attempted suicide. Others were murdered for refusing. Sexually transmitted diseases spread rapidly. Camp doctors didn't treat the victims, they replaced them. More women were sent from Ravensbrück, where the selection process for volunteers was clearly structured. Those who weren't suitable were discarded. In these brothels, clients weren't always soldiers. Certain prisoners were also allowed access: bosses, informers, collaborators, or model prisoners. Those who achieved high production in workshops or factories received a token. The token gave access to 20 minutes with a woman. Everything was timed. There was a waiting list. If a prisoner didn't show up on time, he lost his turn. At Buchenwald, the situation was more complex. Ilse Koch, wife of Commandant Karl Koch, lived there. Ilse didn't run an official brothel. Her private estate, built next to the camp, was the scene of orgies organized by herself. She invited officers, sometimes subordinates. She personally selected women from the camp to participate. Sometimes men too. If anyone refused, they were executed. If anyone complied poorly, they were punished. Ilse Koch developed an obsession with the body. She ordered pregnant women sent to her home. She offered them food and baths, but they were soon beaten, groped, and raped by multiple men while Ilse watched. Sometimes she herself participated. Everything happened in front of mirrors. The rooms were designed as pleasure parlors. The punishment came later. Dogs trained to attack the victims, whips and electric shocks. The orgies were recorded in private notebooks. Ilse jotted down names, dates, and details. She also kept underwear as trophies. In subsequent trials, some of these notebooks were found partially burned. The documentation was sufficient to confirm her active participation in multiple rapes. At the Mittelbau-Dora camp, best known for its underground tunnels where V-2 rockets were manufactured, the brothel was implemented late, but with particularly aggressive methods. Women selected for special service were subjected to forced chemical treatments to stop their menstruation in order to reduce infections and facilitate continuous use without breaks. The procedure was not supervised for medical purposes, but rather for reasons of operational efficiency. Some prisoners reported after the war that they were administered unexplained hormonal compounds and suffered severe side effects: constant nausea, pelvic pain, internal bleeding. There was no follow-up. If reactions became noticeable or compromised performance, they were replaced without warning. At Ravensbrück, the only large concentration camp exclusively for women, a specific brothel selection system was established. Every week, dozens of prisoners underwent forced gynecological examinations. The SS chose candidates based on criteria such as age, physical appearance, build, and reproductive capacity. Body measurements, menstrual history, and family history, if available, were recorded. Some women were marked as unfit and redirected for medical experimentation. Others were approved and sent to other camps for use in brothels. This process was not secret. Many prisoners knew that too long a gaze, too light skin, or too visible breasts could seal their fate. Several SS refusal was actively involved in the management of these brothels. They not only authorized transfers, but also kept detailed records of staff turnover, productivity, health checks, and replacements, as if they were an industrial chain. Some medical reports preserved in the archives of Ravensbrück and Buchenwald show spreadsheets with columns for number of clients served, disciplinary incidents, and physical condition of the inmate. These records were reviewed weekly. In some cases, the doctors also acted as direct supervisors. They monitored schedules, imposed punishments, and signed discharge certificates when a woman was no longer useful. The internal administration of the sexual system functioned as another cog in the concentration camp apparatus. Each camp with a brothel had at least one designated SS officer in charge of its operation. This officer was responsible for coordinating shifts, access times, entry cards, reports on prisoners, complaints from users, and disciplinary measures. The language was technical. The women were treated as logistical assets. In internal communications, they were referred to as restricted use personnel, special resources, or inmates in a protected area. Their existence was documented, but their humanity was nowhere to be seen. The sexual infrastructure of the camps was not a side aberration, nor a depraved initiative of isolated individuals. It was a policy organized, planned, and monitored by the middle levels of the Nazi apparatus. Women were selected, registered, evaluated, used, and discarded. Every rape was recorded as data. Every body was treated as an instrument. Every brothel was part of a policy of systematic control and punishment. The brothels operated under the direct administration of the SS. Each camp that had one designated a responsible guard. This guard controlled the number of clients, supervised the prisoners' behavior, and coordinated replacements. Women who showed signs of exhaustion were removed without explanation. Some were relocated, others simply disappeared. At Auschwitz, a brothel was set up near the industrial workshops. Women deemed suitable were sent there. The proximity to the IG Farben factory meant a constant flow of prisoner workers. Access to the brothel was granted as an incentive to maintain production. Some testimonies describe how the men entered expressionless. They left even emptier. Sexual relations were not intimate. They took place in small rooms, often without beds, sometimes with guards watching. The women didn't speak, they couldn't speak. If they did, they were beaten. Some were drugged with pills dissolved in water. Others were simply forced to smile. At Dachau, an adjoining room was even created just for German political prisoners. The program established specific days based on the prisoners' category. Jews, homosexuals, and Roma were excluded. Records were checked. Men had to report back afterward to ensure there were no complications. If they showed empathy toward the woman, they were punished. Illness was constant. The use of condoms was not permitted. If a woman contracted syphilis or gonorrhea, she was isolated. She was sent to another camp for treatment. Some were later used in medical experiments to test antibiotics. Others died without care. Pregnant women were sterilized, some were forcibly aborted, others were intentionally impregnated to test the effects of new drugs on fetuses. When the Allies arrived at Mauthausen, they found the brothel closed, but with beds still warm. The women who survived didn't speak. Some took decades to testify. Many names were lost. Official documents mention the facilities, those responsible, and the schedules, but not the victims. They were left out of the statistics as if they had never existed. Childhood terror, children as toys of the Nazis. At Auschwitz, a 4-year-old boy was grabbed by an SS guard, lifted by the ankles and thrown against a wall. His mother, still standing, was forced to watch. She didn't cry. An officer placed a pistol to her temple and ordered her not to cry. She obeyed. She was executed minutes later. These scenes were not isolated. They were repeated in camps such as Majdanek, Treblinka and Buchenwald. Children, like adults, were searched upon arrival. Minors were rarely deemed fit for labor, but some were not immediately sent to the gas chamber. They were reserved for other purposes: dog training, marksmanship, cruel games. In the Belarusian camps, officers organized human races. Children who could still walk or run were selected. They were lined up in front of a dirt track. The SS officers, after drinking, bet among themselves on who would hit the target the fastest. The children ran terrified while dogs were unleashed behind them or precision rifles were fired. The survivors were reused. The rest were left on the ground. In other camps, a game called the siren was used. Every time a brief alarm sounded, all the children in the barracks had to run to a specific spot. If any of them stumbled or arrived last, they were taken away to their mother. Both were executed. There were no exceptions. The guards called it playful training. Many children were used as human draft horses. In camps like Poichot, small carts were built that the SS used to transport food or documents between barracks. The children had a rope tied around their necks or waists and were made to pull the load like animals. The officers climbed onto the cart and whipped the children like they were on a ride. If one fell, another replaced them. Age didn't matter. The sadism wasn't always physical. In some blocks, liberation drills were organized. The children were taken to an open area, given new clothes, even candy. They were told their parents were waiting for them. They were lined up next to a ditch and shot in turn. The soldiers laughed at the panic in their eyes. They took photographs. They commented on who had cried the most. Sometimes they bet on who would flee first. Medical experiments reached their extremes at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Dr. Josef Mengele, known as the Angel of Death, specialized in manipulating children. His greatest obsession was twins. He sought to understand how to multiply the birth of identical Aryans. He used Jewish and Roma children as raw material. Among them, Eva and Miriam Kor, twin girls from Romania, were subjected to more than 100 procedures. Mengele separated them. He applied treatments to one, leaving the other healthy. From the first, he drew blood daily, injected chemicals, or subjected him to surgeries without anesthesia. If he died, the second was killed immediately, so their bodies could be compared. On a typical day, Mengele walked around the twins' barracks in a white coat and with a friendly smile. He offered them candy. He called them by name. Then he used them as tools. Mengele injected ink into children's eyes to test whether he could alter the color of their irises. In other cases, he applied caustic agents to the skin. Sometimes he tattooed with fire. Occasionally, he harvested organs for no medical purpose. The children were placed on metal tables. Their limbs were restrained. If they survived, they were returned to the barracks. If they screamed too loudly, they were executed on the spot. The use of children within the Nazi camp system was not limited to punishment or medical experimentation. At various times, especially when faced with the possibility of outside visits or diplomatic inspections, camp officials organized simulated forced marches in which child prisoners were disguised in clean clothes, combed, temporarily fed, and lined up in formation. These displays were intended to demonstrate that the children were being cared for within the system as part of an internal or external propaganda campaign. Once the filming or visits were completed, many of these children were returned to their barracks without food, and some were executed that same night to prevent them from speaking, or especially in Estonia and Latvia, cases were documented in which Jewish children who survived urban roundups were placed in temporary custody by local officials or members of the collaborationist civil administration. The stated objective in some files was to carry out experimental adoptions under the supervision of Reich doctors. The goal was to observe whether these children, raised in an Aryan environment, would develop degenerate behavior or could be re-educated in racial obedience. In practice, many were used as domestic servants and disappeared after a few months. Some testimonies suggest that they were killed at the first sign of rebellion or after being subjected to abuse. The host families were never prosecuted after the war. Another form of institutional manipulation was the use of children as actors in internal propaganda films for the Third Reich. In productions made by the propaganda ministry, certain healthier-looking children, blonde, light-eyed, or simply docile, were forced to participate in dramatized scenes inside the camps. They simulated school activities, played outdoor games, or were fed in front of cameras. These films were not distributed to civilians but were used for internal training of personnel, presenting a civilized image of the camps. After filming, the children were returned to the barracks. Some were secretly executed. In other cases, they disappeared. Research on child development. In camps like Ravensbrück, children were used to test the effects of drugs. They were injected with sulfur drugs, poisons, or unsterilized vaccines. They were also sterilized with surgery or radiation. Some were under 10 years old. Those who resisted were marked with numbers to continue the experiment. Those who didn't were buried in mass graves. The children weren't just used for scientific studies. Some were selected for their interesting features. If a child had blonde hair or blue eyes, they were photographed, measured, and examined. Some were sent to Germany for racial re-education. Others were used for illegal pornography distributed among high-ranking officers. No direct evidence of this practice survives, but documents indicate its existence. In the Lodz camp during the winter of 1944, a group of children were locked up for days without food as collective punishment. One of them, aged 7, managed to sneak away to look for bread. He was caught, stripped naked, and hung by his feet in front of the rest. The officers demanded that all the children watch him. Afterward, they threw him into an icy pit. The punishment was documented by a guard assistant. When the Allies liberated the camps, they found children alive in a skeletal state, with open sores, partial blindness, and missing limbs. Most didn't speak. They didn't recognize their names. Some were adopted. Others died soon after. Many had seen their siblings and parents die and had been used as human playthings in a process that made sadism routine. Horror souvenirs, human trophies, and sadistic decorations. At the Buchenwald concentration camp, a table lamp stood in the officers' lounge. The lampshade was made of tattooed human skin. The body of the prisoner it belonged to was dissected shortly after his execution on the direct orders of SS medical personnel. His skin was selected for its design, an Oriental-style figure in black and red ink. It was tanned, dried, cut out, and mounted as part of an everyday object. This was not an isolated story. Beginning in 1941, concentration camps began to address the selection of corpses that could be used to make personal, decorative, or anatomical objects. The practice was centralized at Buchenwald, but cases have also been documented at Mauthausen, Auschwitz, and Natzweiler-Struthof. Prisoners with tattoos were the most coveted. Upon entering the camp, their bodies were closely examined by SS doctors. If they had tattoos, patriotic or religious symbols, female images, or phrases, they were marked in the files. Sometimes these prisoners were killed without immediate justification. Their bodies were then taken to the infirmary or the Institute of Anatomy in Weimar. There, a team of specialists carefully removed the skin, chemically treated it, and prepared it for use in bookbindings, lampshades, knife sheaths, belts, or wallets. The most famous name linked to this practice is Ilse Koch, wife of Karl Otto Koch, commandant of the Buchenwald camp. Ilse was accused of walking through the barracks and personally marking prisoners with interesting tattoos. According to multiple testimonies, she selected those with aesthetically appealing figures. These prisoners subsequently disappeared. Days later, objects made from their skin appeared in the Koch residence. During the Dachau trials and later in the military internment proceedings, several witnesses testified to seeing tattooed skin framed on the walls of Ilse's house or used to bind books. Others mentioned the existence of table lamps and light shades made of the same material. Although some of this physical evidence was destroyed, the Allies found some remnants upon liberating Buchenwald, skin fragments, carved bones, and internal camp documentation that mentioned these activities. One of the doctors involved in this operation was the anatomist Erich Wagner, who supervised the collection of bodies in collaboration with the University of Jena Medical School. His personal notes, discovered after the war, described the procedure for preserving tattooed human skin for scientific and aesthetic purposes. The specimens were classified by color, detail, and surface. Some were considered especially valuable if they depicted faces or animal figures. In addition to skin, human bones were used as raw material. At Buchenwald and Mauthausen, candlestick and knife holders were made from femurs or tibias. The skulls were cleaned and displayed as trophies. In some cases, they were drilled to be used as paperweights or decorative pieces. The jawbones were mounted on wooden bases. All of this took place inside the offices or residences of Nazi officials. Preserved organs were also used. In the Natzweiler Struthof camp infirmary, SS doctors stored human hearts, lungs, and brains in jars of formalin. Some of these organs came from prisoners killed for their ethnicity, religion, or physical condition. The goal was not to study diseases, but to create a racial collection to demonstrate supposed differences between Jews, Slavs, and Aryans. This collection was sponsored by August Hirt, a professor of anatomy, who personally directed the selection and execution of dozens of prisoners. The wives of Nazi officers played an active role in this institutionalized fetishism. In the case of Ilse Koch, investigations determined that she not only tolerated the fabrication of human objects, but actually requested them. Other testimonies relate that wives of commanders received purses made of human skin as birthday or Christmas gifts. In one instance, documented by American soldiers, a purse with gold initials made of tanned skin was found in an officer's residence at Dachau. The manufacturing process for these objects was coordinated. Once removed, the skin was washed with saline solutions, dried on wooden frames, and treated with formalin and glycerin. It was then stored until a camp artisan, often a forced prisoner, transformed it into a final product. Those involved in this process knew that each piece came from a body into raw material was not limited to skin and bones. In several camps, prisoners' hair was systematically collected, cut en masse from women, men, and children immediately upon arrival. The strands were stored in burlap sacks, labeled with the transport or barrack number, and shipped by the ton to textile factories linked to the Third Reich. At Auschwitz, the shipment of more than 7,000 kilograms of human hair was documented between 1941 and 1944. This material was used to make acoustic and thermal insulation, especially for Kriegsmarine submarines, and also in the manufacture of industrial carpets, mattress stuffing, and ropes. Packages labeled female material special use were found in the Monowitz warehouses, along with instructions for washing and chemical disinfection before processing. Another systematic resource was gold teeth. After each mass execution in the gas chambers, the Sonderkommandos were ordered to search the corpses' mouths for dental crowns, bridges, or metal fillings. Using extraction pliers, they removed the teeth, which were then placed in marked containers and handed over to the SS. At the Auschwitz and Stutthof camps, there were small metallurgical laboratories where the collected teeth were melted down and transformed into ingots. These ingots were then sent to Berlin or used locally to fund camp operations. In documents from the Reichsgesundheitsamt, Reich Health Office, this procedure was referred to as strategic metal recovery. The degree of planning and logistics applied to this economy of death is also reflected in documents seized by Soviet forces after the liberation of camps in Poland. Some of them contained detailed records of human inventory, including more than 200 pieces of tattooed skin stored at Buchenwald and Dachau, sorted by color, size, and pattern quality. These pieces were treated as interchangeable materials, available for binding or decoration upon request. Each piece was numbered. Some included notes such as suitable for a book cover or ideal for a conical lampshade. The existence of these internal catalogues confirms that the collection was not a one-off initiative, but part of an organized production chain with quality standards, hierarchical supervision, and distribution objectives. The Allies discovered material evidence in 1945. Upon liberating Buchenwald, an American commission headed by General Dwight D. Eisenhower inspected the camp and collected artifacts to be used as evidence in the war crimes trials. Among the seized objects were a lamp with a leather shade, a knife sheath with visible seams, and 2 fragments of tattooed skin labeled by SS doctors. During the Nuremberg trials, Ilse Koch's defense team denied that these practices were part of her personal life. However, statements from survivors, forced labor nurses, and prisoners assigned to the camp's leather workshop all agreed. The collection of tattooed skin was not a rumor, it was part of the camp's operations. The exact figures have never been established. Some historians estimate that more than 100 prisoners were killed specifically for the quality of their tattoos, others for their build, age, or musculature useful for dissection. The Strasbourg Institute of Anatomy stored dozens of complete human bodies, many of them from concentration camps. Pieces were also created there for study or exhibition, some sent as gifts to institutes in Berlin and Vienna. They are housed in medical archives, Holocaust museums, or judicial collections. In 2005, a Polish museum discovered a lampshade that was forensically analyzed and confirmed to be human skin. In another case, in 2011, a researcher found an antique bookbinding in Germany containing remains of human skin with visible tattoos. The piece was removed and preserved as evidence. This perversion of the human body transformed into a utilitarian object was not the result of individual disorder. It was coordinated, organized, classified, and distributed. Every fragment of tattooed skin, every carved bone, every preserved organ was part of a mechanism that transformed death into private property. The human zoo, the racial science of the Nazi camps. At the Strasbourg Institute of Anatomy, several glass jars contained human organs floating in formalin. Some were labeled Polish Jew, Hungarian Gypsy, Mongoloid. These were not anonymous specimens. Each of these organs belonged to prisoners deliberately executed to become teaching material at the Reich University. Not for illness, nor for legitimate medical research, but because of their ethnic origin. From the early years of the Third Reich, medicine was transformed into an instrument of racial propaganda. The so-called biology of the people promoted the idea of superior and inferior races based on physical appearance. Under this doctrine, prisoners' bodies were displayed before doctors, professors, and students as degenerate, defective, and subhuman examples. In concentration camps such as Auschwitz, Dachau, and Natzweiler-Struthof, veritable classes in racial medicine were organized. Prisoners were forced to strip naked in front of audiences. They stood motionless while doctors pointed out body parts, curved noses, receding jaws, large ears, slanted eyes. They spoke of racial defects, Semitic atavisms, and genetic degeneration. Prisoners were not allowed to speak. If they did, they were beaten or removed. At Natzweiler-Struthof, a camp located in German-occupied Alsace, these classes took an even more macabre turn. Professor August Hirt, an anatomist at the University of Strasbourg, worked there. Hirt personally organized the construction of a collection of Jewish skeletons to demonstrate the supposed racial differences between Aryans and Semites. For his project, Hirt requested a specific number of prisoners from the Nazi High Command, 86 men and women of Jewish origin, with physical characteristics that represented the classic Semitic type. These prisoners were selected at Auschwitz by SS anthropologist Bruno Beger, who measured and photographed them. They were then transported to Natzweiler-Struthof, where they were killed with hydrogen cyanide gas in a chamber built specifically for this purpose. Their bodies were not buried. They were taken to Strasbourg, where Hirt dissected and numbered them. This collection was kept at the Institute of Anatomy until the end of the war. Although many documents were destroyed, the Allies found 86 labeled skeletons, along with records detailing the name, origin, and date of execution of each. Hirt committed suicide before being captured. At the Ravensbrück camp, the experiment took a different form. There, Roma women were selected for what the Nazis called evolutionary observation. They were confined to individual barracks. They were regularly measured: height, weight, skull size, breast development, menstruation, lung capacity. Changes were precisely noted. Their bodies were photographed. In some cases, they were forced to conceive children to study physical inheritance. Then either they or the babies were eliminated. The German doctors involved in these practices were not marginal. They came from prestigious universities: Heidelberg, Munich, and Berlin. They received bodies from the camps for dissection and analysis. The remains were shipped by train, labeled anatomical material. In many institutions, these human remains were used for years without recording their origin. During the Nuremberg trials, evidence of this collaboration was presented. Letters between camp commandants and university rectors requesting racially interesting skulls, brains, or skeletons. The bodies were required to be fresh, not decomposed. Sometimes camp doctors had to expedite executions to meet delivery deadlines. At Dachau, demonstrations included practical exercises on live prisoners. In one class, intramuscular injections were given, while students observed the physical reaction. In another, the prisoner was subjected to controlled hypoxia to measure pulmonary resistance. In some classes, prisoners were simply stripped naked and pointed at with wooden pointers while the teacher explained their anthropological value. The removed organs were preserved. Complete skulls, livers, uteruses, and hearts were stored in labeled display cases. Some universities used these remains to decorate laboratories. In extreme cases, complete skeletons were prepared on metal stands for permanent display. These materials continued to be used until the 1960s in several German medical schools. In some camps, these classes were held with foreign assistants. Collaborating doctors from Italy, Hungary, and Croatia attended as guests. They took notes and applauded at the end. On one occasion, at Auschwitz, a group of visitors witnessed a session in which 5 naked Jewish and 5 German women were compared. The aim was to demonstrate Aryan racial superiority in terms of body symmetry, skin color, and skull shape. The women were returned to their barracks afterward. 3 of them disappeared the following day. In other camps, prisoners' displays included open wounds. At Ravensbrück, surgical simulations were performed. Prisoners' legs were opened, bacteria or metal fragments were inserted, and the infection was then studied. The wounds were left untreated for days. The women were carried on stretchers before groups of doctors to analyze the development of the septic process. These bodies were never considered patients. They were models, instruments. Some survived months of observation. Others were killed at the end of the experiment. No names were written on the tags, only codes. Medical reports omitted the medical history. Death certificates simply stated cardiac arrest, respiratory collapse, malnutrition. When the Allies discovered August Hertz's collection, they found the remains of 57 still identifiable bodies. They also found photographs of the victims before their execution. As the Reich's racial doctrine became institutionalized, the images captured during so-called anthropological studies were not only stored in medical archives. Many of these photographs, naked women standing with measuring devices in the background, children sitting on cranial measuring tables, men marked with numerical tags hanging from their necks, were reused in German school textbooks and educational brochures between 1942 and 1944. Some books printed by publishers affiliated with the propaganda ministry included comparative tables of racial physiologies, showing the bodies of Jewish, Gypsy, Slavic, or African prisoners as examples of degeneration. These were not fabricated illustrations. They were actual photographs taken in camps like Auschwitz, Sachsenhausen, and Natzweiler. They were not hidden. They were used as teaching material in medical schools, racial training institutes, and party youth centers. During those same years, the system extended its reach to other minorities. African prisoners, many of them colonial soldiers captured after the occupation of France, were sent to camps such as Buchenwald and Natzweiler-Struthof. There they were subjected to what the SS called comparative pigmentation studies, the purpose of which was to observe the resistance of dark skin to chemicals, artificial sun exposure, and decomposition processes. Tests were applied with acids, abrasive solutions, and ultraviolet radiation. Cranial measurements, dental examinations, and post-mortem dissections were also performed. Some testimonies from released prisoners state that the bodies of these Africans were not buried but rather transported to anatomical institutes in numbered wooden boxes. After the end of the war, the material collected during these experiments was not always destroyed. In several German, Austrian, and Czech universities, human remains used for teaching purposes continued to circulate. Coded skulls, complete skeletons mounted in display cases, organs preserved in formalin, and even human skin scarred from experiments were publicly displayed in university museums well into the 1980s, often without the public knowing their origin. Some labels identified the specimens simply as Eastern European Jew, Roma woman, or Black from Togo, without mentioning the conditions under which they were obtained. It was not until the 1990s that academic committees began to investigate the origin of these materials and, in some cases, to remove them from display. This objectification of the human body, transformed into an academic spectacle, was a direct extension of Nazi ideology. Eliminating those who were different wasn't enough. It had to be demonstrated, recorded, exhibited, and taught, as if genocide could be a subject of study.